Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. The Scarecrow Wins the Fight. After Billina had entered the palace, Dorothy and Evring sat down to await the success or failure of her mission, and the Gnome King occupied his throne and smoked his long pipe for a while in a cheerful and contented mood. Then the bell above the throne, which sounded whenever an enchantment was broken, began to ring, and the king gave a start of annoyance and exclaimed, "Rockety-rickets!" When the bell rang a second time, the king shouted angrily, "Smudge and blazes!" And at a third ring he screamed in fury, "Hypocaloric!" which must be a dreadful word, because we don't know what it means. After that the bell went on ringing time after time, but the king was now so violently enraged that he could not utter a word, but hopped out of his throne and all around the room in a mad frenzy, so that he reminded Dorothy of a jumping jack. The girl was, for her part, filled with joy at every peal of the bell, for it announced the fact that Billina had transformed one more ornament into a living person. Dorothy was also amazed at Billina's success, for she could not imagine how the yellow hen was able to guess correctly from all the bewildering number of articles clustered in the rooms of the palace. But after she had counted 10 and the bell continued to ring, she knew that not only the royal family of Ev, but Ozma and her followers also were being restored to their natural forms, and she was so delighted that the antics of the angry king only made her laugh merrily. Perhaps the little monarch could not be more furious than he was before, but the girl's laughter nearly drove him frantic, and he roared at her like a savage beast. Then, as he found that all his enchantments were likely to be dispelled, and his victims every one set free, he suddenly ran to the little door that opened upon the balcony and gave the shrill whistle that summoned his warriors. At once the army filed out of the gold and silver doors in great numbers, and marched up a winding stairs and into the throne room, led by a stern-featured gnome who was their captain. When they had nearly filled the throne room, they formed ranks in the big underground cavern below, and then stood still until they were told what to do next. Dorothy had pressed back to one side of the cavern when the warriors entered, and now she stood holding little Prince Evering's hand, while the great lion crouched upon one side and the enormous tiger crouched on the other side.
"Seize that girl!"
shouted the king to his captain, and a group of warriors sprang forward to obey. But both the lion and the tiger snarled so fiercely and bared their strong, sharp teeth so threateningly that the men drew back in alarm.
"Don't mind them,"
cried the Gnome King.
"They cannot leap beyond the places where they now stand."
"But they can bite those who attempt to touch the girl," said the captain.
"I'll fix that,"
answered the king.
"I'll enchant them again so that they can't open their jaws."
He stepped out of the throne to do this, but just then the Sawhorse ran up behind him and gave the fat monarch a powerful kick with both his wooden hind legs.
"Oh, murder! Treason!"
yelled the king, who had been hurled against several of his warriors and was considerably bruised.
"Who did that?"
"I did," growled the Sawhorse viciously. "You let Dorothy alone, or I'll kick you again."
"We'll see about that,"
replied the king, and at once he waved his hand toward the Sawhorse and muttered a magical word. "Aha!" he continued. "Now let us see you move, you wooden mule." But in spite of the magic, the Sawhorse moved, and he moved so quickly toward the king that the fat little man could not get out of his way. Thump! Bang! came the wooden heels, right against his round body, and the king flew into the air and fell upon the head of his captain, who let him drop flat upon the ground.
"Well, well," said the king, sitting up and looking surprised. "Why didn't my magic belt work, I wonder?"
"The creature is made of wood," replied the captain. Your magic will not work on wood, you know."
"Ah, I'd forgotten that," said the king, getting up and limping to his throne. "Very well, let the girl alone. She can't escape us anyway."
The warriors, who had been rather confused by these incidents, now formed their ranks again, and the Sawhorse pranced across the room to Dorothy and took a position beside the Hungry Tiger. At that moment the doors that led to the palace flew open, and the people of Ev and the people of Oz were disclosed to view. They paused, astonished at the sight of the warriors and the angry Nome King seated in their midst.
"Surrender!" cried the king in a loud voice. "You are my prisoners."
"Go long," answered Billina from the Scarecrow's shoulder. "You promised me that if I guessed correctly my friends and I might depart in safety, and you always keep your promises."
"I said you might leave the palace in safety," retorted the king.
"And so you may, but you cannot leave my dominions. You are my prisoners, and I will hurl you all into my underground dungeons, where the volcanic fires glow and the molten lava flows in every direction, and the air is hotter than blue blazes."
"That will be the end of me, all right," said the Scarecrow sorrowfully. "One small blaze, blue or green, is enough to reduce me to an ash heap."
"Do you surrender?" demanded the king. Billina whispered something in the Scarecrow's ear that made him smile and put his hands in his jacket pockets. "No," returned Ozma, boldly answering the king. Then she said to her army, "Forward, my brave soldiers, and fight for your ruler and yourselves unto death."
"Pardon me, most royal Ozma," replied one of her generals, "but I find that I and my brother officers all suffer from heart disease, and the slightest excitement might kill us. If we fight, we may get excited. Would it not be well for us to avoid this grave danger?"
"Soldiers should not have heart disease," said Ozma.
"Private soldiers are not, I believe, afflicted that way," declared another general, twirling his mustache thoughtfully. "If your royal highness desires, we will order our private to attack yonder warriors."
"Do so," replied Ozma.
"Forward, march!" cried all the generals with one voice. "Forward, march!" yelled the colonels. "Forward, march!" shouted the majors.
"Forward, march!" commanded the captains. And at that the private leveled his spear and dashed furiously upon the foe. The captain of the Nomes was so surprised by this sudden onslaught that he forgot to command his warriors to fight, so that the 10 men in the first row, who stood in front of the private spear, fell over like so many toy soldiers. The spear could not go through their steel armor, however, so the warriors scrambled to their feet again, and by that time the private had knocked over another row of them. Then the captain brought down his battle-axe with such a strong blow that the private's spear was shattered and knocked from his grasp, and he was helpless to fight any longer. The Nome King had left his throne and pressed through his warriors to the front ranks so he could see what was going on, but as he faced Ozma and her friends, the Scarecrow, as if aroused to action by the valor of the private, drew one of Billina's eggs from his right jacket pocket and hurled it straight at the little monarch's head. It struck him squarely in his left eye, where the egg smashed and scattered, as eggs will, and covered his face and hair and beard with its sticky contents.
"Help! Help!"
screamed the king, clawing with his fingers at the egg in a struggle to remove it.
"An egg! An egg! Run for your lives!" shouted the captain of the Gnomes in a voice of horror.
And how they did run! The warriors fairly tumbled over one another in their efforts to escape the fatal poison of that awful egg, and those who could not rush down the winding stair fell off the balcony into the great cavern beneath, knocking over those who stood below them. Even while the king was still yelling for help, his throne room became emptied of every one of his warriors, and before the monarch had managed to clear the egg away from his left eye, the Scarecrow threw the second egg against his right eye, where it smashed and blinded him entirely. The king was unable to flee because he could not see which way to run. So he stood still and howled and shouted and screamed in abject fear. While this was going on, Billina flew over to Dorothy, and perching herself upon the lion's back, the hen whispered eagerly to the girl, "Get his belt! Get the Nome King's jeweled belt! It unbuckles in the back. Quick, Dorothy, quick!" Chapter 18. The Fate of the Tin Woodman. Dorothy obeyed. She ran at once behind the Nome King, who was still trying to free his eyes from the egg, and in a twinkle she had unbuckled his splendid jeweled belt and carried it away with her to her place beside the tiger and lion, where, because she did not know what else to do with it, she fastened it around her own slim waist. Just then the chief steward rushed in with a sponge and a bowl of water, and began mopping away the broken eggs from his master's face. In a few minutes, and while all the party stood looking on, the king regained the use of his eyes, and the first thing he did was to glare wickedly upon the Scarecrow and exclaim, "I'll make you suffer for this, you hay-stuffed dummy! Don't you know eggs are poison to gnomes?" "Really," said the Scarecrow, "they don't seem to agree with you, although I wonder why." "They were strictly fresh and above suspicion," said Billina. "You ought to be glad to get them." "I'll transform you all into scorpions!" cried the king angrily, and began waving his arms and muttering magic words. But none of the people became scorpions, so the king stopped and looked at them in surprise. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Why, you are not wearing your magic belt," replied the chief steward, after looking the king over carefully. "Where is it? What have you done with it?" The Nome King clapped his hand to his waist, and his rock-colored face turned white as chalk. "It's gone!" he cried helplessly. "It's gone, and I am ruined!" Dorothy now stepped forward and said, "Royal Ozma, and you, Queen of Ev, I welcome you and your people back to the land of the living. Billina has saved you from your troubles, and now we will leave this dreadful place and return to Ev as soon as possible." While the child spoke, they could all see that she wore the magic belt, and a great cheer went up from all her friends, which was led by the voices of the Scarecrow and the Private. But the Nome King did not join them. He crept back onto his throne like a whipped dog, and lay there bitterly bemoaning his defeat. "But we have not yet found my faithful follower, the Tin Woodman," said Ozma to Dorothy, "and without him I do not wish to go away." "Nor I," replied Dorothy quickly. "Wasn't he in the palace?" "He must be there," said Billina, "but I had no clue to guide me in guessing the Tin Woodman, so I must have missed him." "We will go back into the rooms," said Dorothy. "This magic belt, I am sure, will help us to find our dear old friend." So she re-entered the palace, the doors of which still stood open, and everyone followed her except the Nome King, the Queen of Ev, and Prince Evring. The mother had taken the little prince in her lap, and was fondling and kissing him lovingly, for he was her youngest born. But the others went with Dorothy, and when she came to the middle of the first room, the girl waved her hand as she had seen the king do, and commanded the Tin Woodman, whatever form he might then have, to resume his proper shape. No result followed this attempt, so Dorothy went into another room and repeated it, and so through all the rooms of the palace. Yet the Tin Woodman did not appear to them, nor could they imagine which among the thousands of ornaments was their transformed friend. Sadly they returned to the throne room, where the king, seeing that they had met with failure, jeered at Dorothy, saying, "You do not know how to use my belt, so it is of no use to you. Give it back to me, and I will let you go free, you and all the people who came with you. As for the royal family of Ev, they are my slaves and shall remain here." "I shall keep the belt," said Dorothy. "But how can you escape without my consent?" asked the king. "Easily enough," answered the girl. "All we need to do is to walk out the way that we came in. "Oh, that's all, is it?" sneered the king. "Well, where is the passage through which you entered this room?" They all looked around, but could not discover the place, for it had long since been closed. Dorothy, however, would not be dismayed. She waved her hand toward the seemingly solid wall of the cavern and said, "I command the passage to open." Instantly the order was obeyed. The opening appeared, and the passage lay plainly before them. The king was amazed, and all the others overjoyed. "Why, then, if the belt obeys you, were we unable to discover the Tin Woodman?" asked Ozma. "I can't imagine," said Dorothy.
"See here, girl," proposed the king eagerly. "Give me the belt, and I will tell you what shape the Tin Woodman was changed into, and then you can easily find him."
Dorothy hesitated, but Billina cried out, "Don't you do it! If the Nome King gets the belt again, he will make every one of us prisoners, for we will be in his power. Only by keeping the belt, Dorothy, will you ever be able to leave this place in safety." "I think that is true," said the Scarecrow, "but I have another idea, due to my excellent brains. Let Dorothy transform the king into a goose egg, unless he agrees to go into the palace and bring out to us the ornament which is our friend Nick Chopper, the Tin Woodman."
"A goose egg!"
echoed the horrified king.
"How dreadful!"
"Well, a goose egg you will be, unless you go and fetch us the ornament we want," declared Billina with a joyful chuckle. "You can see for yourself that Dorothy is able to use the magic belt all right," added the Scarecrow. The Nome King thought it over and finally consented, for he did not want to be a goose egg. So he went into the palace to get the ornament, which was the transformation of the Tin Woodman, and they all awaited his return with considerable impatience, for they were anxious to leave this underground cavern and see the sunshine once more. But when the Nome King came back, he brought nothing with him except a puzzled and anxious expression upon his face.
"He's gone," he said. "The Tin Woodman is nowhere in the palace."
"Are you sure?" asked Ozma sternly.
"I'm very sure," answered the king tremblingly, "for I know just what I transformed him into, and exactly where he stood. But he is not there. And please don't change me into a goose egg, because I've done the best I could."
They were all silent for a time, and then Dorothy said, "There is no use punishing the Nome King any more, and I'm 'fraid we'll have to go away without our friend." "If he is not here, we cannot rescue him," agreed the Scarecrow sadly. "Poor Nick! I wonder what has become of him."
"And he owed me 6 weeks' back pay,"
said one of the generals, wiping the tears from his eyes with his gold-laced coat-sleeve. Very sorrowfully they determined to return to the upper world without their former companion, and so Ozma gave the order to begin the march through the passage. The army went first, and then the royal family of Ev, and afterward came Dorothy, Ozma, Billina, the Scarecrow, and Tik-Tok. They left the Nome King scowling at them from his throne, and had no thought of danger until Ozma chanced to look back and saw a large number of the warriors following them in full chase, with their swords and spears and axes raised to strike down the fugitives as soon as they drew near enough. Evidently the Nome King had made this last attempt to prevent their escaping him, but it did no good, for when Dorothy saw the danger they were in, she stopped and waved her hand and whispered a command to the magic belt. Instantly the foremost warriors became eggs, which rolled upon the floor of the cavern in such numbers that those behind could not advance without stepping upon them. But when they saw the eggs, all desire to advance departed the warriors, and they turned and fled madly into the cavern and refused to go back again. Our friends had no further trouble in reaching the end of the passage, and soon were standing in the outer air upon the gloomy path between the two high mountains. But the way to Ev lay plainly before them, and they fervently hoped that they had seen the last of the Nome King and of his dreadful palace. The cavalcade was led by Ozma, mounted upon the Cowardly Lion, and the Queen of Ev, who rode upon the back of the tiger. The children of the Queen walked behind her, hand in hand, Dorothy rode the Sawhorse, while the Scarecrow walked and commanded the army in the absence of the Tin Woodman. Presently the way began to lighten, and more of the sunshine to come in between the two mountains, and before long they heard the thump, thump, thump of the giant's hammer upon the road. "How may we pass the monstrous man of iron?" asked the Queen, anxious for the safety of her children. But Dorothy solved the problem by a word to the magic belt. The giant paused with his hammer held motionless in the air, thus allowing the entire party to pass between his cast-iron legs in safety. Chapter 19. The King of Ev. If there were any shifting, rock-colored gnomes on the mountainside now, they were silent and respectful, for our adventurers were not annoyed, as before, by their impudent laughter. Really, the gnomes had nothing to laugh at since the defeat of their king. On the other side they found Ozma's golden chariot, standing as they had left it. Soon the lion and the tiger were harnessed to the beautiful chariot, in which was enough room for Ozma and the Queen and 6 of the royal children. Little Evring preferred to ride with Dorothy upon the Sawhorse, which had a long back. The Prince had recovered from his shyness and had become very fond of the girl who had rescued him, so they were fast friends and chatted pleasantly together as they rode along. Billina was also perched upon the head of the wooden steed, which seemed not to mind the added weight in the least, and the boy was full of wonder that a hen could talk and say such sensible things. When they came to the gulf, Ozma's magic carpet carried them all over it in safety, and now they began to pass the trees in which birds were singing, and the breeze that was wafted to them from the farms of Ev was spicy with flowers and new-mown hay, and the sunshine fell full upon them to warm them and drive away from their bodies the chill and dampness of the underground kingdom of the gnomes. "I would be quite content," said the Scarecrow to Tik-Tok, "were only the Tin Woodman with us, but it breaks my heart to leave him behind." "He was a fine fellow," replied Tik-Tok, "although his material was not very durable." "Oh, tin is an excellent material," the Scarecrow hastened to say, "and if anything ever happened to poor Nick Chopper, he was always easily soldered. Besides, he did not have to be wound up, and was not liable to get out of order." "I sometimes wish," said Tik-Tok, "that I was stuffed with straw as you are. It is hard to be made of copper." "I have no reason to complain of my lot," replied the Scarecrow. "A little fresh straw now and then makes me as good as new, but I can never be the polished gentleman that my poor departed friend the Tin Woodman was." You may be sure the royal children of Ev and their queen mother were delighted at seeing again their beloved country, and when the towers of the palace of Ev came into view they could not forbear cheering at the sight. Little Evring, riding in front of Dorothy, was so overjoyed that he took a curious tin whistle from his pocket and blew a shrill blast that made the Sawhorse leap and prance in sudden alarm. "What was that?" asked Billina, who had been obliged to flutter her wings in order to keep her seat upon the head of the frightened Sawhorse. "That's my whistle," said Prince Evring, holding it out upon his hand. It was in the shape of a little fat pig, made of tin and painted green. The whistle was in the tail of the pig. "Where did you get it?" asked the yellow hen, closely examining the toy with her bright eyes. "Why, I picked it up in the Nome King's palace while Dorothy was making her guesses, and I put it in my pocket," answered the little prince. Billina laughed, or at least she made the peculiar cackle that served her for a laugh. "No wonder I couldn't find the Tin Woodman," she said, "and no wonder the magic belt didn't make him appear, or the king couldn't find him either." "What do you mean?" questioned Dorothy. "Why, the prince had him in his pocket!" cried Billina, cackling again. "I did not!" protested little Evring. "I only took the whistle." "Well, then, watch me," returned the hen, and reaching out a claw, she touched the whistle and said, "Ev." Swish! "Good afternoon," said the Tin Woodman, taking off his funnel cap and bowing to Dorothy and the Prince. "I think I must have been asleep for the first time since I was made of tin, for I do not remember our leaving the Nome King."
"You have been enchanted," answered the girl, throwing an arm around her old friend and hugging him tight in her joy.
"But it's all right now."
"I want my whistle," said the little prince, beginning to cry.
"Hush," cautioned Billina. "The whistle is lost, but you may have another when you get home." The Scarecrow had fairly thrown himself upon the bosom of his old comrade, so surprised and delighted was he to see him again, and Tik-Tok squeezed the Tin Woodman's hand so earnestly that he dented some of his fingers. Then they had to make way for Ozma to welcome the Tin Man, and the army caught sight of him and set up a cheer, and everybody was delighted and happy. For the Tin Woodman was a great favorite with all who knew him, and his sudden recovery after they had thought he was lost to them forever was indeed a pleasant surprise. Before long the cavalcade arrived at the royal palace, where a great crowd of people had gathered to welcome their queen and her 10 children. There was much shouting and cheering, and the people threw flowers in their path, and every face wore a happy smile. They found the Princess Langwidere in her mirrored chamber, where she was admiring one of her handsomest heads, one with rich chestnut hair, dreamy walnut eyes, and a shapely hickory nut nose. She was very glad to be relieved of her duties to the people of Ev, and the queen graciously permitted her to retain her rooms and her cabinet of heads as long as she lived. Then the queen took her eldest son out upon a balcony that overlooked the crowd of subjects gathered below, and said to them, "Here is your future ruler, King Evardo 15th. He is 15 years of age, has 15 silver buckles on his jacket, and is the 15th Evardo to rule the land of Ev." The people shouted their approval 15 times, and even the Wheelers, some of whom were present, loudly promised to obey the new king. So the queen placed a big crown of gold set with rubies upon Evardo's head, and threw an ermine robe over his shoulders, and proclaimed him king, and he bowed gratefully to all his subjects, and then went away to see if he could find any cake in the royal pantry. Ozma of Oz and her people, as well as Dorothy, Tik-Tok, and Billina, were splendidly entertained by the Queen Mother, who owed all her happiness to their kind offices, and that evening the Yellow Hen was publicly presented with a beautiful necklace of pearls and sapphires as a token of esteem from the new king. Chapter 20. The Emerald City. Dorothy decided to accept Ozma's invitation to return with her to the land of Oz. There was no greater chance of her getting home from Ev than from Oz, and the little girl was anxious to see once more the country where she had encountered such wonderful adventures. By this time Uncle Henry would have reached Australia in his ship, and had probably given her up for lost, so he couldn't worry any more than he did if she stayed away from him a while longer. So she would go to Oz. They bade good-bye to the people of Ev, and the king promised Ozma that he would ever be grateful to her and render the land of Oz any service that might lie within his power. And then they approached the edge of the dangerous desert, and Ozma threw down the magic carpet, which at once unrolled far enough for all of them to walk upon it without being crowded. Tik-Tok, claiming to be Dorothy's faithful follower because he belonged to her, had been permitted to join the party, and before they started the girl wound up his machinery as far as possible, and the copper man stepped off as briskly as any one of them. Ozma also invited Billina to visit the land of Oz, and the Yellow Hen was glad enough to go where new sights and scenes awaited her. They began the trip across the desert early in the morning, and as they stopped only long enough for Billina to lay her daily egg, before sunset they espied the green slopes and wooded hills of the beautiful land of Oz. They entered it in the Munchkin territory, and the King of the Munchkins met them at the border and welcomed Ozma with great respect, being very pleased by her safe return. For Ozma of Oz ruled the King of the Munchkins, the King of the Winkies, the King of the Quadlings, and the King of the Gillikins, just as those kings ruled their own people. And this supreme ruler of the land of Oz lived in a great town of her own, called the Emerald City, which was in the exact center of the four kingdoms of the land of Oz. The Munchkin king entertained them at his palace that night, and in the morning they set out for the Emerald City, traveling over a road of yellow brick that led straight to the jewel-studded gates. Everywhere the people turned out to greet their beloved Ozma, and to hail joyfully the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion, who were popular favorites. Dorothy, too, remembered some of the people who had befriended her on the occasion of her first visit to Oz, and they were well pleased to see the little Kansas girl again, and showered her with compliments and good wishes. At one place, where they stopped to refresh themselves, Ozma accepted a bowl of milk from the hands of a pretty dairymaid. Then she looked at the girl more closely and exclaimed, "Why, it's Ginger, isn't it?" "Yes, your Highness," was the reply, as Ginger dropped a low curtsy. And Dorothy looked wonderingly at this lively-appearing person, who had once assembled an army of women and driven the Scarecrow from the throne of the Emerald City, and even fought a battle with the powerful army of Glinda the Sorceress. "I've married a man who owns 9 cows," said Ginger to Ozma, "and now I am happy and contented and willing to lead a quiet life and mind my own business." "Where is your husband?" asked Ozma. "He's in the house, nursing a black eye," replied Ginger calmly. "The foolish man would insist upon milking the red cow when I wanted him to milk the white one, but he will know better next time, I am sure." Then the party moved on again, and after crossing a broad river on a ferry and passing many fine farmhouses that were dome-shaped and painted a pretty green color, they came in sight of a large building that was covered with flags and bunting. "I don't remember that building," said Dorothy. "What is it?" "That is the College of Art and Athletic Perfection," replied Ozma. "I had it built quite recently, and the Woggle Bug is its president. It keeps him busy, and the young men who attend the college are no worse off than they were before. You see, in this country are a number of youths who do not like to work, and the college is an excellent place for them." And now they came in sight of the Emerald City, and the people flocked out to greet their lovely ruler. There were several bands and many officers and officials of the realm, and a crowd of citizens in their holiday attire. Thus the beautiful Ozma was escorted by a brilliant procession to her royal city, and so great was the cheering that she was obliged to constantly bow to the right and left to acknowledge the greetings of her subjects. That evening there was a grand reception in the royal palace, attended by the most important persons of Oz, and Jack Pumpkinhead, who was a little overripe but still active, read an address congratulating Ozma of Oz upon the success of her generous mission to rescue the royal family of a neighboring kingdom. Then magnificent gold medals set with precious stones were presented to each of the 26 officers, and the Tin Woodman was given a new axe studded with diamonds, and the Scarecrow received a silver jar of complexion powder. Dorothy was presented with a pretty coronet and made a Princess of Oz, and Tik-Tok received 2 bracelets set with 8 rows of very clear and sparkling emeralds. Afterward they sat down to a splendid feast, and Ozma put Dorothy at her right and Billina at her left, where the hen sat upon a golden roost and ate from a jeweled platter. Then were placed the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and Tik-Tok, with baskets of lovely flowers before them, because they did not require food. The 26 officers were at the lower end of the table, and the Lion and the Tiger also had seats, and were served on golden platters that held a half a bushel at one time. The wealthiest and most important citizens of the Emerald City were proud to wait upon these famous adventurers, and they were assisted by a sprightly little maid named Jellia Jam, whom the Scarecrow pinched upon her rosy cheeks and seemed to know very well. During the feast Ozma grew thoughtful, and suddenly she asked, "Where is the private?" "Oh, he is sweeping out the barracks," replied one of the generals, who was busy eating a leg of a turkey. "But I have ordered him a dish of bread and molasses to eat when his work is done." "Let him be sent for," said the girl ruler. While they waited for this command to be obeyed, she inquired, "Have we any other privates in the armies?" "Oh, yes," replied the Tin Woodman. "I believe there are 3 altogether." The private now entered, saluting his officers and the royal Ozma very respectfully. "What is your name, my man?" asked the girl. "Omby Amby," answered the private. "Then, Omby Amby," said she, "I promote you to be Captain General of all the armies of my kingdom, and especially to be commander of my bodyguard at the royal palace." "It is very expensive to hold so many offices," said the private, hesitating. "I have no money with which to buy uniforms." "You shall be supplied from the royal treasury," said Ozma. Then the private was given a seat at the table, where the other officers welcomed him cordially, and the feasting and merriment were resumed. Suddenly Jellia Jam exclaimed, "There is nothing more to eat! The hungry tiger has consumed everything!" "But that is not the worst of it," declared the tiger mournfully. "Somewhere, or somehow, I've actually lost my appetite." Chapter 21. Dorothy's Magic Belt. Dorothy passed several very happy weeks in the Land of Oz as the guest of the royal Ozma, who delighted to please and interest the little Kansas girl. Many new acquaintances were formed and many old ones renewed, and wherever she went Dorothy found herself among friends. One day, however, as she sat in Ozma's private room, she noticed hanging upon the wall a picture which constantly changed in appearance, at one time showing a meadow, and at another time a forest, a lake, or a village. "How curious!" she exclaimed, after watching the shifting scenes for a few moments. "Yes," said Ozma, "that is really a wonderful invention in magic. If I wish to see any part of the world or any person living, I need only express the wish, and it is shown in the picture." "May I use it?" asked Dorothy eagerly. "Of course, my dear." "Then I'd like to see the old Kansas farm and Aunt Em," said the girl. Instantly the well-remembered farmhouse appeared in the picture, and Aunt Em could be seen quite plainly. She was engaged in washing dishes by the kitchen window, and seemed quite well and contented. The hired men and the teams were in the harvest fields behind the house, and the corn and wheat seemed to the child to be in prime condition. On the side porch Dorothy's pet dog Toto was lying fast asleep in the sun, and to her surprise old Speckles was running around with a brood of 12 new chickens trailing after her. "Everything seems all right at home," said Dorothy with a sigh of relief. "Now I wonder what Uncle Henry is doing." The scene in the picture at once shifted to Australia, where, in a pleasant room in Sydney, Uncle Henry was seated in an easy chair, solemnly smoking his briar pipe. He looked sad and lonely, and his hair was now quite white and his hands and face thin and wasted. "Oh!" cried Dorothy in an anxious voice, "I'm sure Uncle Henry isn't getting any better, and it's because he is worried about me. Ozma, dear, I must go to him at once." "How can you?" asked Ozma. "I don't know," replied Dorothy, "but let us go to Glinda the Good. I'm sure she will help me and advise me how to get to Uncle Henry." Ozma readily agreed to this plan, and caused the Sawhorse to be harnessed to a pretty green and pink phaeton, and the 2 girls rode away to visit the famous sorceress. Glinda received them graciously, and listened to Dorothy's story with attention. "I have the magic belt, you know," said the little girl. "If I buckled it around my waist and commanded it to take me to Uncle Henry, wouldn't it do so?" "I think so," replied Glinda with a smile. "And then," continued Dorothy, "if I ever wanted to come back here again, the belt would bring me." "In that you are wrong," said the sorceress. "The belt has magical powers only while it is in some fairy country, such as the Land of Oz or the Land of Ev. Indeed, my little friend, were you to wear it and wish yourself in Australia with your uncle, the wish would doubtless be fulfilled, because it was made in Fairyland. But you would not find the magic belt around you when you arrived at your destination." "What would become of it?" asked the girl. "It would be lost, as were your silver shoes when you visited Oz before, and no one would ever see it again. It seems too bad to destroy the use of the magic belt in that way, doesn't it? "Then," said Dorothy after a moment's thought, "I will give the magic belt to Ozma, for she can use it in her own country, and she can wish me transported to Uncle Henry without losing the belt." "That is a wise plan," replied Glinda. So they rode back to the Emerald City, and on the way it was arranged that every Saturday morning Ozma would look at Dorothy in her magic picture wherever the little girl might chance to be, and if she saw Dorothy make a certain signal, then Ozma would know that the little Kansas girl wanted to revisit the land of Oz, and by means of the Nome King's magic belt would wish that she might instantly return. This having been agreed upon, Dorothy bade good-bye to all her friends. Tik-Tok wanted to go to Australia, too, but Dorothy knew that the machine man would never do for a servant in a civilized country, and the chances were that his machinery wouldn't work at all, so she left him in Ozma's care. Billina, on the contrary, preferred the land of Oz to any other country, and refused to accompany Dorothy. "The bugs and ants that I find here are the finest flavored in the world," declared the yellow hen, "and there are plenty of them. So here I shall end my days, and I must say, Dorothy, my dear, that you are very foolish to go back into that stupid humdrum world again." "Uncle Henry needs me," said Dorothy, simply, and every one except Billina thought it was right that she should go. All Dorothy's friends of the land of Oz, both old and new, gathered in a group in front of the palace to bid her a sorrowful good-bye, and to wish her long life and happiness. After much handshaking, Dorothy kissed Ozma once more, and then handed her the Nome King's magic belt, saying, "Now, dear Princess, when I wave my handkerchief, please wish me with Uncle Henry. I'm awfully sorry to leave you, and the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion, and Tik-Tok, and everybody, but I do want my Uncle Henry. So, good-bye, all of you." Then the little girl stood on one of the big emeralds which decorated the courtyard, and after looking once again at each of her friends, waved her handkerchief. "No," said Dorothy, "I wasn't drowned at all, and I've come to nurse you and take care of you, Uncle Henry, and you must promise to get well as soon as possible." Uncle Henry smiled and cuddled his little niece close in his lap. "I'm better already, my darling," said he. End of Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Recorded by Phil Chenevert.